Hello, and welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf with me, Samia Aziz. On this show, I interview incredible authors doing a deep dive into important themes and issues while talking all things books. On this week's episode, I'm talking to Vanessa Chan about her debut novel, an absolutely mesmerising story set across two timelines, 1930s and 1945 in Malaya, which is what Malaysia was called before independence. The Storm We Made is a story with four different perspectives following the decision made by one woman to become a spy for Japan and the dreadful consequences that befall her family and country afterwards. Vanessa Chan is the Malaysian author of The Storm We Made, a national bestseller, Good Morning America book club pick, and BBC Two radio book club pick. It was acquired by international publishers in a flurry of auctions, and her first novel will be published in more than 20 languages worldwide. Her other work has been published in Vogue, Esquire, and more. Vanessa grew up in Malaysia and is now based mostly in Brooklyn. I cannot wait to speak to her today. Hello, Vanessa. Welcome to the Diverse Bookshelf podcast. It's so great to have you on the show. How are you doing?
Thank you for having me. I'm doing great. It's allergy season here in New York City, so everyone's a little bit sniffly. The trees like to make us an important part of their reproductive process, and so we're just sneezing a little bit, all of us over here.
We're quite sniffly here as well. My eyes have been watering all
I
morning.
know.
I love it's so frustrating because we have waited so many months, like 6 months, for this glorious sunshine, but it has brought with it
I
pollen,
know all of
which is
this.
not ideal.
Exactly. I'm just like, you want me to go outside, but then I have to sneeze my way through to survive. So we'll see. We'll see how it goes.
We'll see. Absolutely. But yeah, I'm so excited to have you on the show. So your debut novel is called The Storm We Made, and the UK cover is just beautiful. Like it's just a whole load of different colors. We've got some silhouettes going on. But as a novel, wow, it is so captivating. It's such a page turner. I think I read it within 24 hours just because I couldn't put it down. I was so sort of desperate to know what was going to happen and what had happened. And oh my gosh, it's very captivating. And I think I was just so holding on for a happy ending. And we don't really get a happy ending, but I guess, I don't think it would have been true to the story you were telling had it ended with more rainbows and sunshine. So, congratulations also because it's very newly out in the world and it is your debut novel. Yeah, it's just, I thought it was absolutely brilliant. So, before we get into talking about the book itself, tell me a little bit about your writing journey. How did you come to write more generally? But then, what about this particular book?
Sure. So thank you so much. Those are very kind words and a very lovely introduction. People always ask me, have you always been writing? And I guess I've been writing in the way that, like, when you're a child, you write like bad poems to your parents um, for their birthdays and things like that. For the record, even though I've published a book now, my family does whip out those bad poems to do dramatic readings of when I'm back in Malaysia because family does keep you humble. Um, but I put that away. Like, I've always enjoyed writing, but I never foresaw it as any kind of career because I moved to the US to study for undergrad and then graduated into a financial crisis as a foreigner who needed a work visa. And so I just had to do all these different jobs that would sponsor my visa, and none of which were in the arts. I had to do all these different corporate jobs, and immigration had me by the neck. I had to do all these different things to stay here if I made the choice to stay in the US. And so writing fell by the wayside. I think in my earlier 20s, when I was first working, I did try to write a novel or half a novel, an autofiction novel about how much I hated all my coworkers at the time. Turns out that sort of rage doesn't make for a good novel, so that went away. And it was only after I got residency in the US that I could think about what it was that I really wanted to do beyond stay here and survive. And um, I thought to give the writing thing a shot. So I applied to graduate programs and didn't get into many places actually. I got into one or two, and I followed the one that accepted me and to New York City, and that is where I started writing this novel. I started writing this novel as a class assignment. My instructor had, for the end of at the end of the first semester, we had this random assignment, which was, I think, write a short story about someone who does something on loop. But it was the end of semester, and so I thought it was a throwaway assignment. In graduate school, creative writing in certain places, especially in the program I was at, there's
Mm.
no grading. And so you just turn in your assignment, you get an A. I'm like, easy peasy. And so I wrote this short story about a girl who's running through a bunch of checkpoints to get home, turned it in, forgot about it, and then got a note back from this instructor that said, this wasn't a short story. And I'm like, wow, not me failing my first ungraded assignment that I have been assigned here in graduate school. And then she goes on, she goes, I think this is much more than that. And I think you need to spend more time with this. I think this might be your life's work. And I was like, me? I can barely write. I just started this program. I took her advice and kept writing through the pandemic, through a series of personal griefs, which we can talk about in a minute. And that was just what, 3 years ago. And then this book came through, and the rest of the process has been quite a dream. It took me a while to get to figuring that writing was a thing I wanted to do for the rest of my life, but now we're here. And this book is out in the world, and some days I wake up, can't believe it.
That's really, you spoke about how you were having to jump through all of these hoops for immigration. And I think that's a really relatable,
Oh yeah.
like a relatable thing that a lot of people go through, not necessarily with immigration, but like just trying to get through life and get and find some stability that gives you the space and, you know, like the privilege to have the time to focus on writing, because a writing career and writing for a living is not a linear, it's not a linear process. And it's not like you don't apply for a job in the way that you can apply for a job to work in finance, for example. You don't apply to be an author and then therefore you have the time that you are paid for to write. You have to be able to have the time, and that always is a form of privilege in one way or another. And for so many people, sometimes it's just about, I don't have the time because I have a family or I have to work to pay bills. Or in your case, like I need to figure out how I can stay in this country legally. There's so many different things. And I think that sometimes just understanding that if you so desperately want to be a writer, it's not always in your hands whether or not you have the time to pursue that. And I think there's a lot of, sometimes we internalize that as, oh, if I'm failing to do it, even though like I really want to do it. But there's so many different things to consider. But you've spoken already about the fact that you wrote this in lockdown, but I'm really interested in what led to you writing this specific book. Why did you decide to tell this story?
I mentioned earlier that that homework assignment was to write about a character who does something on loop, something repetitive. And the first thing I wrote that came out was about this woman, this teenage girl actually running through a series of repetitive checkpoints to get home. And if you've read the book, you'll know that that's the framing for chapter 4. And I didn't expect that to come out. I always thought that I would end up writing as my first book some kind of like millennial novel about someone having an existential crisis, because that is what I know, right?
Mm.
It's a millennial who always has existential crises. It is a familiar environment. And I always thought that was what I would write. And lo and behold, the first thing that comes out that my teacher ends up telling me and will be my life's work is this like complex, heart wrenching first chapter of a historical novel. I'm like, what? How did that happen? But I think I had to realize that over the years, I'm the eldest child on my grandparents, on my paternal grandparents' side. I spent a lot of time with them growing up, and my cousins will argue, but it was self evident that I was the favorite. So I spent all this time there, and my grandma would talk to me. And over the years, a bunch of different stories came up during our conversations. Some of them came up in the form of like warnings. Oh, if I didn't finish my dinner, I get something like, during the Japanese times, we didn't even have enough to eat. We had to mix in tapioca and paper with our rice rations to survive. Or if I didn't want to go to my extramural activities, extracurricular activities, she'd be like, we didn't even have those. During the Japanese
Mhm.
time, you'd have to sneak into the neighbor's yard from a hole in the fence just to take dance lessons with the neighbors next door. And there was things like that. And stories small and large like, stuck with me. And when I was ready to write a novel, this is what came out. It came these stories that my grandma had told me ended up becoming like the backdrop, if that makes sense, the realities and the environment at which I started to write about. And I was like, wow, I guess these have lived in me for a really long time and just needed the right combination of maturity, emotional maturity, physical maturity, and maybe spare time and freed up brain space in order for me to push these stories out. I never expected to write. I never expected to be like the family scribe or like the
Mm.
scribe of the nation. That was never something that I thought I would be or aspired to be. I'm not a historian, but that sometimes the art and the writing leads you to where you need to go. And in this case, this was the compulsion that I was given to write, and I followed it and wrote through the compulsion that I was handed. And that's what we have, this like sad historical novel about Malaysia. Not what I expected at all to be my first book.
Wow, and it is really sad. Like it's very bleak, and like there's some really
That's the
difficult things
nature.
that.
That's the nature, I think, of. I think once I started writing it, no, as a writer, you have a series of choices that you need to
Mm,
make, right? Whether or not you want your book, you there are four characters in there that each have to make a series of choices, and I got to make a series of choices about what happens to them. Do they
mm,
turn left or right? Do they survive? Do they not survive? And I think once I realized that this was the book that I was going to write, and there was no running from it, then I had to decide whether or not I would sanitize this history I already knew existed
mm,
that didn't really have its place in history books, right? And history books don't really talk about the impact of the Second World War and occupation on Asia, much less Southeast Asia. And then I had to think about whether or not sanitizing and cleaning up that history was something that I would do for this book, my first book.
yeah.
And I don't believe in gratuitous violence, and I hope the book doesn't extend gratuitous violence and gratuitous abuse, but I think it is quite frank, I think, in its approach to what happened during the time. Obviously, there are lots of it that's fiction. That's the woman at the center of it is a spy. As far as I know, no one in my family is a spy, but I guess I wouldn't know. But for the most part, some of the more brutal and terrible things that were inflicted upon the people of Malaysia during the time, true and felt necessary to record.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you're right. Like, we shouldn't be sanitizing history. And I think, especially when it comes to something that we already, like, collectively know so little about, something that has somewhat been omitted or wiped out from common narratives in history and curricula the world over. And so, absolutely, like I think because I knew what it was about, I wasn't expecting a happy story. I mean, craving a happy ending is something very different. I wasn't expecting a happy story
Oh,
because,
absolutely.
yeah, like you don't. We if we have an idea of history and we understand war, then I don't think we could have expected anything less than something sad. But you write with a lot of detail, a lot of like very graphic. Some of the scenes are very graphic and very difficult to read as a reader. But as you said, I think important to understand also the many facets of war and the way that civilians are impacted. And this is the world over, like we're seeing it so blatantly right now around the world as well. And also a reminder as well that things that we're witnessing, for example, in Sudan or in Palestine, like these are not new. These are not new phenomena. It's been happening the world over, unfortunately. Not that it justifies or makes sense of it. It's important, I think, to understand that as well. Before we move on, can you just introduce the storm we made? You just tell us a little bit about what it is.
Sure. The Storm We Made, my first novel, is about the very unlikeliest of spies, a woman named Cecily Alcantara, who is a wife and mother in 1930s British Malaya, which is what Malaysia used to be called under British rule. And she at the time is the wife to a local government administrator, and while solidly middle class, right? She enjoys some level of privilege, but despite this, is terribly discontent with her lot in life and feels unfulfilled, feels like a woman out of time, and wants something more. But because her mother's mother and all the other women around her are doing exactly what it is she's doing, she has no models for what more could look like as a woman in her time, which makes her ripe pickings for a Japanese spy who is roaming around Malaya at the time, looking to build an inroad to enable an invasion of Japan into British Malaya. And so he recruits her to be a spy, and together, as the story goes, they usher in his case on purpose, in her case almost unwittingly, Japanese occupation to Malaysia, which begins the Second World War and essentially is the most violent occupation the country has ever seen. And of course, these actions that she takes over in the 30s and into the 40s have a strong and terrible impact on her three children, who are aged between 7 and 17, who are living through the war, noticing that a lot of misfortune, more misfortune than expected, befalls their family. And they're just trying to survive, but they have no idea of their mother's secret, and she's trying to keep it that way while trying to protect them.
Yeah. And it is, as I've said, like it's very immersive. It's such a page turner. We don't really, I personally couldn't really, didn't have any idea what was going to end up happening. So I was like constantly waiting to see. And I was very captivated by the two timelines. And you give us four different points of view and you give us two different timelines. And I feel as an author to get that right, to get to be able to still move the story forward, to not leave us like constantly confused between the different perspectives and the different timelines, I feel like it's a real feat to be able to do that well. And I never felt confused. I think just, which is what sometimes happens when you've got different perspectives, is that you become so engrossed in one person's story, you don't want it to finish and to have to move on, and you become a little bit frustrated when it does happen. But I think it was so important for us and so easy for us to then just become immersed into the next perspective. But what was the process like for you putting that together, to get to have these four different perspectives and these two timelines? Yeah, how did you manage that and how did that come into fruition?
Yeah, exactly. As you say, four point of views and two timelines, which writers ask me, oh, is this sort of a structure you recommend for others? And my answer is a vehement no. It was very complex to write and
Yeah.
required a lot of walking around in a circle in my small apartment, muttering to myself to try to keep all the plot lines straight. And in addition to that, there were the markers of history, right, that I had to follow, because I had to make sure that I marked the correct things that were happening in history at the time. And so essentially there were two timelines plus all these additional dates. I recommend it, but I think that it was necessary for the book. In terms of the point of views, which are a mother and her three children, an eldest daughter, a middle son who goes missing, and a youngest daughter who just wants everyone to be happy. I think I always knew that the book would have multiple point of views, and I've I've always liked books that are like that, and I enjoy writing that way. And I never really knew why until I thought about it more deeply and realized I come from a pretty large extended family. My
Mm.
father has 39 living first cousins.
Wow.
My grandma his mother had 10, and there were 10 of them, nine siblings. And so I grew up in sort of a noisy, gossipy environment. And I would get all this information from different aunties about some mini little scandal that was happening in the neighborhood, in the family. And you'd get all these different sources like throwing their points of view and what they think happened. And even as a child, I would collect all of these sources, synthesize them in my mind, and get to some version of the truth, some sort of linear truth. And I think that's just how I process information. I also grew up enjoying, like, loving to talk and gossip. And so I think all of that became a starting point for my book, where you get all these four different people living through a similar experience with a similar war with different experiences and different outcomes, and I put them all together. And then as the book goes, as you see, it all comes to a head on a single day. And I think that's just how I process information. It's all my aunties teaching me how to gossip. In terms of the two timelines, when I first wrote this book, I was writing about three children and then the impact that their mother's actions in the past would have on their present during the end of the war. And I was writing in one timeline and it was difficult, right? I was
Mm.
complaining to my mentor at the time, a writer named Mira Jacob, an absolutely incredible writer. And I was like, gosh, Mira, it's so difficult trying to write this book. And I have to write so much flashback in order to bring the reader back in time to show them what Cecily's actions, the mother's actions, do that have an impact on the present. And it's so hard. There's so much flashback. It's so much going back in time. It's wonky. It's not working. When you write four point of views, you need to have one timeline. And she goes, hold up. Who said that? And I
Mm.
was like, it is said that when you write four multiple point of views, you have to have at least just one timeline to keep it straight so people aren't confused. And she goes, no, you said that. It's not a rule.
Mm.
And I was like, oh no, it's a rule. And the thing to know about me is I'm a rule follower. I was like, oh no, it's a rule. She goes, no, you said that. It's not a thing. Why
Mm.
don't you try this? Try to write more than one timeline, see what happens. You can always change it. And we went back and forth like this for a while until I figured to try it. And sure enough, the two timelines worked better. And the moral of the story is have someone to talk you out of the rules that you create for yourself that are not real.
Mm. I really enjoy reading multiple perspectives. And I think because, like you, like I have a very loud, very big family. And so whenever something happens, there's one incident that's happened, but I am talking to seven different people about it.
Yeah,
And I love the fact that I'm having seven different conversations about this one
yeah.
thing that's happening. And it's very rare that I'm saying the same thing to each person. So I completely get that. And I really just, even as a reader, I really enjoy it because I love the psyche of being in different people's minds, even if it isn't the same thing that we're looking at, but we're looking perhaps within one timeline, for example. And it's a reminder that there's so many different things happening at one point, and people are going through different things and they're experiencing the world in different ways, and they've got their own prejudices, but also their own concerns and stuff, and their own the way that they see the world, especially when we're looking at people of different ages as well, and really fascinating. And I'm so glad that you were talked out of this rule that you had made up for yourself. And I don't think you would realize that you made it up yourself.
And that's yeah, that and I think that just happens when part of writing a novel is like floundering around in the dark because you think you're going to do something, write it one way, and then
Yeah.
you realize it's not working. You have to go back and start over. And I think the brain automatically creates these rules and parameters in order to try to keep you like on the straight and narrow, so you can keep writing forward. And this was one of the things that I had to dismantle before I got to the end of this book. And you were saying, I always think that it's fun when you're reading multiple point of views. It feels like a little bonus, right? Like
Yeah.
instead of getting one story, you got four for the price of one. It feels fun. Like I love a multi point of view. I've read books with more than like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 point of views, and I'm like, it just feels like a little bonus to myself, a gift to myself to get so many stories.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this story, as you've mentioned, was inspired by your own family, and obviously, like it's fiction, but it is a very real
Yeah.
timeline. And you've spoken about the fact that you grew up hearing these stories from your grandmother, anecdotes and lessons. But what was it like when you tried to get some more like meat or a better understanding of what happened from your grandmother? What was that process like?
It's funny you ask because if I were to ask her directly, like, what was life like? If I tried to formally interview her, what was life like during the war, during the Second World War, during occupation? She didn't want to talk about it. None of
Mm.
our grandparents did. She'd tell me to mind my own beeswax, go back to my chores, my homework, or what have you, and just to leave her alone. So that is not was not the way to get any kind of information from her. But she's also a really chatty woman. And so I realized that if maybe this was an indicator that I was a writer from a young age, if I just kept quiet and let her have her day and we go along with our business, these stories were the things that would come out. She would start
Mm.
chatting about her experiences both before the war, after the war, and during the war. And all of these different anecdotes and stories would come up. I can tell you one of them actually because it's a really good one that kind of frames what my grandmother was like, but also the ways in which she told the story, which was not often congruent to what was happening. Like she would tell the story with humor or in a very straightforward way when it was like a very, in my opinion, traumatizing thing that would happen.
Mm.
Um, And that's how I excavated these things from her, almost in conversation, just
Mm,
like as human beings. So my grandma tells this incredible story about how one day it was during the occupation, daytime, her and her siblings were like out and about. And then she realized she needs to rush home to get something. And she's, oh, crap, I gotta go. So she gets on a bicycle, which is how they went around at the time. She cycles really quickly and she's on her way. And as she's cycling, she hears a really loud boom behind her, like an explosion. But it's war, and they know. And she was about 12 or 13 at the time. She knew you don't look back, you just keep cycling forward. And so she did. She just did it home, got home, and was fine, and learned that there was an unscheduled like airstrike behind her. And she missed it by a couple of feet, but she was like, I'm good. I'm home. It's all good. But
mm,
remember, there were no phones or no ways to get in touch with people at the time, and her siblings didn't know that she got home in one piece. So they realized this unscheduled airstrike happened on their sister's cycling path home. They were like, oh no. And so they're like really worried. They're like, oh my gosh, do we have to tell our mom that we lost our sister today and we didn't know what happened? And
mm,
so they rush to the pile of rubble and start digging for her, like anything, arm, a leg, like a piece of jewelry, anything they could find to to take home to their mother to prove that like they found their sister. And they don't find
mm,
anything. They're freaking
mm,
out. And they're all children. They're like aging young digit age to like teenagers. And they're like, oh my gosh, we have to go home and tell our mom this. And so they're hysterical. They're crying. They run home.
mm.
And when they get to the door, my grandma is draped in the doorway, laughing her butt off. She was, you thought I died, but I didn't die. I'm right here, and you're all crying, huh? And she is laughing so hard, and her siblings are furious. They're like relieved, but they're also like, this kid, we're going to kill her. And but if you think about it, this story is a terrible story, but my grandma tells it. She told it right to the end of her life, and she lived till 94, as like the best prank she'd ever played on her siblings. And as you can imagine, like I'm sitting here listening to the story, like, Grandma, do you know what nearly happened to you? She was like, okay, but the look on their faces though was just so classic. It was so good. These kinds of stories, as you can imagine, kind of stick with you and stay in your mind. And I collected these over the years. They just became a texture of who I am. Like, this is my family. This is what my grandma is like, where she always like laughs about the most inappropriate things. And I think when I was ready to write a novel, these are the things that kind of came out, made it in, became the setting and the details, you will, of the novel that I hope lend it authenticity.
Absolutely. And did you, because I know, and I think we know this again, like the world over, like talking about trauma, I think especially the generation of your grandmother, talking about these traumatic events, like is very difficult. And that's why so many people find it so hard to share those stories. Did you get that sense of like sadness or grief, like when you would ask, or was it just very much like a straightforward, like, I don't.
I think that the way that this generation processed their grief was actually they very much just wanted to move forward, and they really
Mm,
did want to talk about what happened. And like I said, if I were to ask her directly, and a lot of people in my generation say they try to interview their grandparents because all of us are really worried that this history is going to die with their generation because it's not really recorded that well. And if we ask them, like, what was life like, they don't want to talk about it, right? They're
mm,
reluctant to talk about it. They don't want to bring themselves back there. A lot of them were teenagers or even younger, and such a formative time and so traumatic that they don't really want to go there at all. So but like I said, my grandma's really chatty, and so the stories that would come out, um yeah, not often in these what you would expect to be a traditionally emotional way. They would
mm,
come out in the form of like oddly placed humor, or as warnings, or as like advice, or
mm,
as, we didn't get to do what you got to do when I was 12 years old. I was living through a war. And it was in a different tone than you would expect, right? My grandma wasn't sitting there like bawling her eyes out telling us about how her brother went missing and then came
mm,
back at the end of the war. She would tell us in a way that seemed so somewhat incongruent, I think, with the experience.
mm,
She'd be like, he disappeared, we didn't know where he went, very straightforward. And then goes, and then yay, he came back and we were so lucky. And I was like, okay, but there's a gap. Like, what happened to him? And no one would discuss. And yeah, I think it was parsing through the definitely incongruent emotional aspects of the stories that would come through. Um, And it wasn't what you would expect. It wasn't just a whole lot of tears. It was just, let's keep moving forward, and the stories that would come out would be straightforward.
Mm, absolutely. And so when it comes to Malaysian history, as we said, we don't really know very much about what happened, especially at that time. And I think there's an idea now that Malaysia is a really great holiday location and it's so beautiful. The people are really nice, and but again, but actually, its history is like very violent, very bleak, very bloody. What were some of the things that you were really, I guess, conscious of, or what was really important to you to bring out about Malaysian history, especially within this time period and the Japanese occupation?
I think first and foremost, I will say that I always see my responsibility as a fiction writer is to tell a good story, because I need people to turn the pages. Otherwise, they're not going to absorb anything, and they're not going to, no matter how important or how necessary the learning of this history is. If I can't make people turn the page, if I can't make them interested in the book or invested, I've already failed, right? I
Yeah.
failed out the door. And so I always think my number one responsibility as a writer is to tell a good story and keep people turning the pages. And then beyond that, I think it was important to me, as I said earlier, to not engage in gratuitous violence and not spend like pages and pages on like sexual assault. It was important to me to record, quite honestly, some of the things that happened during the time without kind of putting like a shiny little pretty sheen on it to make it better. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to be honest about the violences that were inflicted at the time. And I think third, I think this, and this is me, for me, a little bit more personal, is I also try to write nuanced characters, right? I
Mm,
don't believe in 100% heroism. And I think you
mm,
see that in the characters who all make choices that maybe in the best of times didn't seem like the most principled choices they could be making. But I also think that against a backdrop of survival and against the backdrop of just trying to stay alive, that we don't always know if our principles are going to hold. And I think in my storytelling and in my recording of history, it was important for me to reflect the human experience,
mm.
which is such that the most heroic principled choice is not always the first choice that people make. And that, I think, leads to some, I wouldn't use the word criticism, but like feedback, reader feedback, that like some of these characters were less likable than they could have been. Um, but I think that's just an honest reflection of who or what humanity is, right?
Yeah,
And that was
yeah.
important for me to reflect as well.
Absolutely. And I mean, we see that, I think, most clearly with Cecily, who is a very morally grey character. And I guess like she is the protagonist in the sense that like she's at the center of everything that happens. And as you said, that she meets this Japanese general and she ends up becoming a spy. And oh my gosh, I throughout the book, I mean, her character changes a lot. And I think we go from like somebody who was really discontent with her life. She seemed a little bit bored, a bit frustrated. And that is very relatable. And I think it's quite relatable in the millennial struggle as well, of like feeling like you're just not thriving. Like you're just not living your best life. You're not thriving. You're not like making a difference. Sometimes so many days go by and I wonder, oh, do people even remember that I'm here? It's very relatable. She's made a series of decisions, got married, got a family, and then it becomes something different because she finds what she believes to be a cause, and she's so enamored by this General Fujiwara, and she like is not only does she is she enamored by him, but she really gets sucked into believing that what she's doing is right. And me, very much felt, does she realize that what she's doing is wrong, or does she genuinely believe that what she's doing is right? Because then we're dealing with a different kind of morality and a different kind of like gray morality. But then later on, when she meets Lena, she I think becomes quite mean, and because then it's very much like she's very jealous and there's all this other kind of stuff. And I love the fact that like she changed so much, and my impression of her and my idea of her also changed so much, and how much I liked her and how much I felt like I could relate and understand her, because by the end I couldn't really, but at the beginning I was like, oh yeah, maybe I can understand how this could happen. But why did you, yeah, what were you trying to really get across, I think, with her character and how, and all the decisions that she made? And I guess when it comes to the grey morality of her.
As I said, I really don't believe that like characters that are 100% good make for good characters. There's no conflict. There's just no story there. And I think I just wanted to show us a character who contains multiple selves, right? She is someone who is somewhat she's good at the life that she's been given, but it's a small life. She's discontent about it. Turns out she's good at all these other things as well, like being a spy and collecting intel, and realizes, oh, that's great, I could have a job too. And then turns out that she craves friendships and builds those too, but at the end, spoiler alert, is perhaps not as good of a friend as she could be. And
Mm.
if I'm honest with you, so I we talked a little bit earlier about, I alluded to it about how I wrote this book during lockdown, during a time of obviously great macro grief for the world, but also a bit more micro grief for myself. So the world locked down in March 2020, and my mother died of a long illness in April 2020, and I couldn't go to her. I couldn't
I'm sorry.
be with her at the end, and it was quite difficult. My uncle actually also passed within 2 weeks. He was passed in London. My mother was in another part of the US, and it was all very challenging, and I was really pissed off, right? And when I first started to write this book, it was just three sad children living through the war. There was no Cecily, actually, because
Mm.
that's what I knew, right? I knew about teenagers and children going through the war because that's what my family had. And if you can believe it, the book was even sadder than it was now, which, whew. So I was during lockdown, trying to write about home and just furious because I couldn't go home. I couldn't with my family during a time that was really difficult. And so I just needed to give myself some grace and agency. And I was like, I need to wake up every morning and write this book because this is what's keeping me sane. These children are too sad. And so I need to give myself someone who gets to like, who have agency, be an adult, run around, be irresponsible, make some weird decisions. And I can always take it. I'm a writer, right? I'm the master of this universe. I can always take it out if it doesn't work out. And so that's how Cecily was born. She was
Mm.
born out of the like rage and frustration and need to have agency to give myself an experiment that could go around and do things that maybe I couldn't do at the time. And responsible, be horny, be ridiculous. And she's a spy because I frankly like to read and watch spy stuff. And I was like, I could take her out. Who cares? Just put her in for now, see what happens. Then lo and behold, she became my main character. And so I think her morally gray ambiguity, her like inner rage, and her like bad decision making probably reflects my mental state at the time. And of course my genuine belief that 100% good characters don't make for good reading or good storytelling. And that's how she came about. She was born from my own lockdown experiences as an experiment. Never really thought I'd keep her, and then she became the emotional core of the book.
Mm. I think that's so beautiful in the sense that like that period, that those lockdown years, the COVID pandemic, there was so much grief. And obviously, as you said, like on a macro level, but also for you on a micro level. And then so many families were, be it temporarily, but separated. We couldn't travel to be with one another, and it was out of our hands. And I think there was something that was like so strangely frustrating and uncertain about that time. And then I guess we see that through the book because our family does, the family that we do, they do get separated. And as you were talking, like it very much reminded me that the characters, the children in the book, everything happened to them. Like they didn't
They
have
had no agency. Yeah.
agency, especially when it came to Abel. My goodness, poor boy. Like everything, like so much happened to him where he just didn't have ability to make any decisions. Like literally, he was just taken, right? We won't say too much because we don't want to give away spoilers. But yeah, and so all of this things happened to them. And now that you've said it, I guess the only character within that family that had agency was Cecily. She was the only one that was making decisions, be they reckless or be they right or wrong is a separate issue. But she was the only one, at least in the 30s, who was making those decisions. And there's something really interesting about that.
And I want to
But
make clear that,
yeah,
like, a book about three sad children living through a war who don't have agency, like, that is a valid premise, because
absolutely.
that's just
Yeah.
how the world is. But I think it just for me personally at the time, I'm like, I gotta give myself someone who has agency because now I'm a writer without, I felt like someone without agency writing about sad children. And I'm like, the only way for me to keep writing this book is to give myself some kind of a tiny gift. And I gave myself the agency in the form of a, like, totally deranged and perhaps problematic character, but
Yeah.
she got to do stuff, and that made the book move forward because I could wake up every day and write it.
Yeah, and also three sad children living in war. If you were to try to give one of those agency, I guess what could have happened is like this sanitization or this almost like glorification of an element of war, which is not what you wanted to do, which is one of the frustrations that we have. This like the way that we glorify resilience, or that it is glorified, resilience is glorified, and it's not, I don't think it's not accurate, and it's not fair, because actually like we can't expect people when they're living through war to rise up against it, or to somehow find and be the superhero when things are so awful. And so I think it completely makes sense to me that the best way to have agency was to have the character of Cecily, who number one is an adult, but made these decisions slightly earlier on, and it's just very
Mhm.
fascinating. But so we have General Fujiwara, who is the person that Cecily becomes enamored with, and he is a spy. He's working undercover. He was a very interesting character, because I mean, although Cecily is like completely, she falls in love with him, I was not particularly impressed with him, but maybe that's just because I was very cautious of him to begin with. But what was really interesting to me was that at the time that in the 30s, what we have is, we have, I guess, like a British rule or occupation going on. And what General Fujiwara convinces Cecily of is basically a Japanese occupation. So they go from like one form of occupation to another, and he's very much Asians for Asians. And what was really interesting to me was that what there wasn't ever like a sowing of the seed of was independence or autonomy. And instead, she was very much happy to go from one occupation to another, and she felt as though the Japanese occupation had to be better because they were so frustrated with what was happening under British rule. But actually what we know was that the Japanese occupation was the most brutal that Malaysia has had ever seen, and it was awful. And obviously there's a lot of history and a lot of stuff that goes on there. But what was, and obviously that's my reading of it, but what was it writing that character of General Fujiwara, and this decision to support the Japanese in this way? What was all that about?
I mentioned earlier that Cecily was living in a time where she didn't have any other models for behavior, right? Her mother and her mother's mother before her had lived the life that she was living, and that's all that she knew. And by the same token, Cecily and her mother's mother before her had seen years and years of colonization. Malaysia has been colonized by the Portuguese, at that point, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and the British before the Japanese arrived, for, at that point, over 400 years, right? They had no other model for what a country could look like, and certainly no model for independence, right? The idea of an independent and liberated Malaya was not even like conceivable, right?
Yeah.
The only conception that one could have that made sense was, maybe you'll have a better colonizer, you'll have a different boss. You're not going to be able to freelance because that was just not the way things were, and people couldn't
Mm,
imagine a world like that. And so it felt real to me that she would attach herself to someone who was offering a better boss, not no boss, because
mm,
that was just not possible for them at that time. What he was offering her was an Asia ruled by Asians, people that look like you, who could bring a more equal, if not completely equal, a more equal world to fore. And of course, realistically, that didn't happen. We know that. Hindsight is 2020, history is 2020, but I think that it is realistic for someone to conceive at the time that, like, hey, it could be better. I could have a different colonizer. But back to the question of Fujiwara. Fujiwara is based on a real historical figure called General Yamashita, who did lead the invasion of Malaya from the north. From He led in an army of soldiers riding in on bicycles through the jungle while the British cannons expected a naval attack, so they pointed their cannons the wrong way to the south and the east towards the ocean. And that is was like a brilliant military strategy that enabled the quick assault and invasion of Malaya and of Southeast Asia. What we do know from history about this guy is he's a small build. He is obviously a brilliant military strategist, and he was called the Tiger of Malaya. But that's all we have. We don't know if he is a true believer or just like a really good soldier. We don't know if he cheated on his wife. We don't know what he's like as a person. And so I think I, as a storyteller, was able to take those facts that I knew and fill in the gaps that in history and build out a character who is, I think, the true villain of this novel. I also framed him up based on a couple of different inspirations. One, the character of Tony Leung in Lust Caution was like an inspiration, someone who is very charismatic, doing the wrong thing, you feel drawn to him anyway. The second was, honestly, you touched a little bit on this earlier. That guy that your friend is dating, and everyone else is, I don't really see the appeal. I'm like, what is up with him? But your friend is chanted. Your friend, there's something up with this guy, some charisma that your friend is responding to that no one else understands, is like super toxic.
Yeah.
And that is what I framed him on. As we all know, that guy, that friend, or it could have been us at some point in our life.
Yeah.
And it's a recognizable thing where no one understands it, but it's there. There is a charisma there that draws certain people in. And the third is I am quite fascinated with the concept of charisma, that some
Mm.
people, no matter their height or attractiveness level, just draw people to them. And I was
Mm.
curious to explore that on the pages and put all of that together, and you got like this really villainous general who, for some reason, Cecily becomes obsessed with.
Yeah, I definitely know that guy. I definitely know that guy. And that is exactly what I was alluding to. To me, he was definitely that guy. If I was her friend, if I was Cecily's friend, and she told me that about this guy, I would just be like, oh, he doesn't seem very impressive. I don't see what the big deal is. But yeah,
Like,
and I
he's
guess
kind of short, and then your friend is no, but he's amazing, and you're like, okay.
like it just because Cecily was like frustrated in her own life, and I guess what he, regardless of the vision of Japanese rule, he was exciting. It was exciting, and she was going to have purpose. And I think we can all relate to that as well. When you don't, when you don't know how bad the situation could get. I don't know. I guess it's down to the readers to decide whether or not they think she was just a bit too naive or whether they can completely understand where she was coming from. And I guess there's probably a mix of it, right? It's probably a bit of both. But I really liked the storyline of uh, Juju and the older Japanese gentleman that comes to the cafe. Is it Mr. Tashaki?
Takahashi.
Takahashi, that's it. Yeah, sorry. I really loved that storyline, that sub storyline, because I just found it. There was something very lovely about. I always like these intergenerational, grandfather, grandchild
Friendships. Yeah.
friendship. Yeah, but what I found really interesting about that was that he is Japanese, but he is a Japanese civilian. He's not a member of the military or occupation forces or whatever. But he's a teacher and he's a civilian. He's living in Malaya, but Juju really struggles. She really struggles, I think, sometimes to see him living a life better than what her and her family are doing. She knows that he has more access to food because he sometimes very kindly gives them his food voucher, but also he gets letters from his daughter and he gets these bits of good news. What were you really interested in exploring with those two characters and that friendship and that sort of interaction?
I actually was one of those people who was always very careful to delineate between the people and their government, right? And she was always it was very important to her to tell me that not all Japanese are bad. And she was like, which is not something I think honestly that like everyone believed at the time. There are people in my grandma's generation in Malaysia today who still hold a large grudge against Japan and its people in general. But my grandma always said, look, people are not their governments. It is, indisputable that the military police, the soldiers, they're horrible, right? They treated us like crap.
Yeah.
But that there were a lot of civilians at the time who were perfectly nice people and who in some ways were helpful to us. And she actually did have a friend from work at the time who was very kind to her, who on whom I based this character a little bit. And that is what I wanted to explore, right? That I wanted to build nuance into the book to show that this is not a nation of villains. These are a
Mm.
nation of some villains, and then some people were just there. But at the same time, I knew that a friendship between a Japanese man living in Malaya, no matter how nice and lovely and charitable he was, and a beleaguered eldest daughter whose family is just going through some stuff, was
Mm.
never going to be equal. And I thought that she was old enough to understand that inequality was always going to be a challenge and a barrier between them that he may not see, right? And that happens in these sorts of unequal sort of friendships where the person being charitable thinks that, oh, I'm just helping out a friend and we're two of the same. And the person receiving the charity
Mm.
realizes almost immediately, is completely aware at all times of the inequity that exists between them, because these are not two friends in the same plane. And I think
Mm.
I wanted to show that. I wanted to show her inner distress at knowing that this was a good person, but who would always have more than she had and would always be proffering her something, and she would never be able to see their friendship as equal, and so she
Mm.
resented it, and even when he was at his kindest and nicest. And so that felt like an important inner life for me to build. Also, honestly, Jujube is like a beleaguered eldest daughter who feels the weight of her entire family on her shoulders, and sure, the stakes are different, but that was the easiest character for me to write, because as a beleaguered eldest daughter myself, I fully understand her like irritation and rage, and it's like, why isn't everyone just doing what they're told so they don't get in trouble and stay where they need to be, and like not go out, in the case of her sister, running about getting in trouble, or in her mother's case, like just not being the mother that she should be at a time like this. And so
Mm.
that was easy for me to write.
Yeah, she was a great character, and I think like she's a teenager and she was very frustrated with everyone around her. And I think because for her it seemed so simple. We know what the threats are, like we know what could happen, so it's so clear. Like why can't we just do it? And she's very aggressive and she's very blunt, shouting at everyone, telling people what to do, physically,
Her very eldest
locking her
daughter, she's,
sister.
come on, just do the thing you're supposed to do, and everyone is, we don't want to, and she's like, why?
Yeah, she was a great character, and I think it's again like it just speaks volume to the kind of woman that your grandmother was, to focus on those elements and to remind you, because it is sometimes difficult when, especially like for us, to look at governments and to sort of almost like divorce that from civilians, because it's not to lay blame on ordinary people for the things that governments do, but it is difficult, I think, to sometimes make that distinction, because it's not straightforward, because there's always privilege and inequality
Yes.
associated with these things. It's not just about, oh, but it's not their fault. There's like many different layers to it.
Yeah.
One of the other things I really enjoyed reading about was the friendship between Alina and Cecily, because we don't really see much friendship throughout the book. This is like the only real, there is one like a child level as well, but this is, I guess, the biggest friendship we see, and it's tied into the relationship that both of these women have with General Fujiwara. And actually, Cecily is not very sincere. She doesn't really want to be Lena's friend. She sees her as the enemy. She's like frustrated and jealous and angry. But what we see from Lena is like she desperately wants a friend, because she's not really accepted, although she's married this man who works for, initially he was working for the Brajuna. Like although she has some status and privilege, she's not really accepted because she's got her own murky past with her own previous husband, all this kind of stuff going on. But she's so desperate to be friends with Cecily, and we don't see the same from her. Maybe at some point very later on. What were you really interested in exploring when it comes to friendships, and especially the friendship between these two characters?
The friendship between, I think, Cecily and Lena is It was one of the most, I think, interesting for me to write.
Mm.
Lena, I think, is perhaps, with the exception of the child, the
Mm.
youngest child, the purest, most good character, I think, in the book, right? Because
Yeah.
her intentions are always frank, genuine, and pure, and all she wants is the best for people, and she assumes that people are the same, right? She is all purity and goodness. And I think I wanted, and we know Cecily from the beginning, we know that Cecily is very morally gray. I think wanted to reflect to our reader and to Cecily the kind of woman that she could be, but would never be. This pure, good hearted person who wants a friend, who wants community, and who just wants to hang out
Yeah.
even when times are tough. And I think, I don't want to give too much away because spoilers, but I think Cecily eventually wears down and realizes like what a good person, a good friend Lena is, and
Yeah.
sort of, falls into a sort of comfortable friendship, after which she does some things that are not friend like. But I think I'm a great believer in female friendship. I'm a great believer in both the intensity but also the wonders of such a friendship. And I wanted to incorporate that into this novel,
Mm.
even though I knew that it could never really end well because our main character is just not someone for whom happy endings occur and friendships endure. But it was important for me to show that. I wanted to just create a mirror for our main character to be like, this is what a good looks like,
Mm.
which created, I think, a more startling contrast between her and who she was and
Yeah,
who she
absolutely. Yeah, it was really interesting, I think, to see them so close together as like such opposites.
noticed that each character has their mirror, right? Jujube has Mr. Takahashi, who is good.
Yeah.
Cecily has Lena. Abel has Freddie,
Yeah.
who does some things that perhaps are not good, but is a good person. And then Jasmine has Yuki, which is the other way around. But they all have mirror characters. It was important for me to reflect, I think, the differences from one to the other.
Yeah, that was that. Yeah, I definitely did feel that all the key relationships between the characters were just based on opposites, whether it was just opposites in circumstance or character. But especially, I think with Abel and Freddie, that was yeah. The Abel scenes were the hardest to read and the saddest throughout the book, honestly. But I think you did such a good job and such an important task in shedding light on the violence that happens of war, the hidden things and also the not so hidden things as well. And on that, so much of the book is, as we've said, is sad and is violent. For you writing it, how did you do it, and like how did you like inject joy in your own life to make sure that you weren't completely getting lost in the sadness of it all?
I said it earlier, right? I created an adult that got to go around a child would not get to do. I think that was honestly, my biggest solution for myself. The other thing is, as a writer, we often, it's a joke within writers, but we cheat on our genre, right? So while I was writing this long, epic novel about war, I was also writing different short stories about funnier things. And also, when things in the pandemic improved, also the key is to get outside sometimes. It's amazing what sunshine and a little bit of hydration will do to get you back on track.
Mm.
I didn't, I mean, people have asked me before, did you get lost in the violence, and was it very upsetting? And it was upsetting to me to understand as I continued to write that the 1940s was not that long ago,
Yeah.
and that there are like people in my life and in my family and in my community who had lived through that,
Yeah.
and that this is a real, even though I'm storytelling and writing fiction, that these circumstances were real, and that was quite sometimes like quite confronting to
Mm.
realize. But at the same time, I think in creating all these little boundaries for myself, like writing other things and writing one adult and getting out sometimes, I think I was not necessarily caught in the muck affect me so terribly in the way that sometimes with other novelists I think it does, right? You do
Mm.
get like emotionally distraught and you can't get out of the muck.
Yeah, that sounds, I think, like also some like general advice for people as well. I'm glad that you
Get
had.
outside sometimes.
Yeah.
But I have a community of friends and writers who are all very helpful and lovely. And I don't write 24 hours a day and try not to write 24 hours a day. And so I don't have to immerse myself in like war and terror 24 hours a day. Though that said, probably not going to write a second war novel anytime soon. I'm going
Yeah.
to write something lighter and a little easier on myself.
Great, great. And you know what, Vanessa, it has been so lovely speaking to you. But just as we wrap up, I know we've been talking for a long time. What are your hopes for the book? What do you hope for anyone picking it up?
People like remember how they felt when they read the book, right? So it's not, I don't expect people to remember every plot twist, who died, who lived, all of that.
Hmm.
But this is, again, this is a history that's not really written down. And I wrote down these stories, and the way that stories become histories, you write them down on paper. And so I did that step. And I'm hopeful that if people remember how they felt when they read the book, they have a takeaway feeling. That will mean that they will discuss it with other people. And the only way for kind of history to become like generally known truth is if people keep talking about it. So I'm
Hmm.
hoping that people take away how they felt, keep the book in discussion, continue to talk about their experiences, and those shared experiences will make the book and the experiences in the book, which are based in reality, but generally held truth.
Yeah. Oh,
That's kind
yeah.
of that's how history becomes real.
Exactly, for more people to know and then talk about it so that more people can know. And obviously, like, this is fiction. You haven't written a historical nonfiction book, but I think it will go a lot of way in just encouraging people to think about the things that we don't know, and also then maybe inspire people to look up and find
Mhm.
out more about what happened.
Inspire other writers who are exploring similar things to feel encouraged to keep going.
Yeah, absolutely. Vanessa, it has been so lovely speaking to you today. Thank you
So
so much for your time.
I appreciate you. Thank you so much. Have a good one.
If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the Diverse Bookshelf podcast on your podcast platform of choice and connect with me on social media. I would love to hear from you. It would also mean so much if you could rate and leave a review, as it helps more people find the show.